A sudden spike in the electricity bill caught my attention, so I quickly called the power company. An employee came over and, with a puzzled look, asked if we'd noticed a certain wire before. When Bob and I hurried over, the employee gently moved a potted plant to reveal a strange wire extending from our outdoor outlet towards my in-laws' house. "Do you know anything about this wire?" the employee asked. Bob and I exchanged glances, probably thinking the same thing. "Hey Bob, could this be?" I started. "Yeah, no doubt about it. This is why our electric bill went through the roof," Bob replied. Almost instinctively, Bob reached for the outlet and swiftly unplugged the wire. The very next moment, a sharp scream echoed from my in-laws' direction. It was probably my mother-in-law. Soon after, I heard some hysterical muttering. The voice grew louder as it approached, and suddenly my mother-in-law burst out from the bushes. "My name is Mary Johnson, a 32-year-old stay-at-home mom, and my hobby is trying out limited-time desserts. I always gather information about desserts either through friends or by doing my own research. Bob, my kind husband, always supports my hobbies. I've known Bob, who is the same age as me, since college, and I've always adored his consistent kindness. By the way, I also had a deep fondness for my in-laws, who raised such a wonderful man. Many of my married friends often complain about issues with their mothers-in-law, and I've even heard stories about marriages ending because of them. But thankfully, such tales have nothing to do with our household. My mother-in-law, like me, is a fan of desserts, and whenever I bring her a recommended treat, she's always delighted. My father-in-law, though a man of few words, always has a reassuring smile. Both of them have always been fond of me, and I felt the same about them. My in-laws currently live about a 30-minute drive away. Not too close, but not too far either, just the right distance. But sometimes I wonder if we could all live together. It's not that I want to live together, but perhaps we might get along better than expected. I adored them enough to entertain such thoughts. However, I soon realized that life isn't always that sweet. One day, Bob surprised me with unexpected news. His parents were moving into the vacant house next door. I had always assumed they owned their place, but it turns out they were renting, and their house had gotten old. When they found out about the empty house next to ours, they jumped at the opportunity. It was a sudden, close proximity move that immediately filled me with anxiety. Up until now, I had gotten along with my in-laws without any issues, but now, living next door meant we could see each other every day if we wanted to. While I do like my in-laws, seeing them daily felt overwhelming. It wasn't something I could easily object to, though. When we first heard about the move, Bob gently advised his parents, "Maybe you shouldn't," but they dismissed the concern, saying, "We get along so well now. It'll be fine. We thought we could eat and live together." I wanted to smack my overly optimistic self for thinking that way. As my anxiety grew, my in-laws moved in. We greeted them cautiously, and at first, things seemed okay. We maintained a good distance and set some boundaries. But as they settled in, my mother-in-law began to push boundaries like never before. She started doing all the things you hear about in horror stories. Dropping by unannounced became her usual behavior, and once inside, she acted like it was her own house. It felt like they were checking our every move. Then, one day, my mother-in-law dropped by unannounced and checked on our dinner. She said something outrageous. "Hey, Mary, I've been thinking, maybe you could stop locking the door." What? I couldn't believe my ears. Can you imagine, in this day and age, my mother-in-law suggesting we leave our house unlocked? Not locking the door means not knowing who could walk in at any time. That's just not safe. It's obviously a bad idea. Ever since my mother-in-law moved in nearby, even the doorbell ringing makes my heart race. Now there's the possibility she could just walk into our home without us even knowing. I'm certainly not okay with that. With how things are lately, I've got to admit, not locking the door feels kind of scary. Trying to keep things light. I declined with a smile, but she frowned and replied, "Oh, Mary, you're such a warrior. But don't worry, I'll tell our neighbors to look out for you, and don't forget your father-in-law and I are here too. We'll be popping in frequently." I understood that her words came from a place of caring, and I appreciated that. That's why I couldn't bring myself to tell her how burdensome her frequent visits had become. But everyone has their limits. Last week, it felt like she had perfect attendance at our home. I had tea with my mother-in-law every day, and naturally, spending this much time together, some grievances arose. I've come to truly understand that a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship is all about the right distance. She would leave unnecessary potted plants in our yard or plant flowers without asking, like she does whatever she wants. If this happened once every few months, I could tolerate it, but every day is a different story. Since the locking incident, she's brought it up several times. I managed to convince her by saying I was just a wife with strong security concerns. However, with that settled, my mother-in-law then started pleading, "I'd like a spare key." I knew I had to get Bob to refuse her request. Handing such a powerful item to her now was just out of the question. Though I found myself at odds with how she behaved, I didn't quite dislike her. She can be meddlesome, but I know it comes from her good intentions. Rather, I felt more guilt for rejecting her than anything else. But as time passed, those feelings began to change. Whether it was me changing, my mother-in-law changing, or both, I can't be sure. However, I started to feel discomfort and irritation with her comments. A few months after she moved in, it had become a routine for my mother-in-law to visit after lunch. I once asked about my father-in-law, and it seems he usually goes for walks or shopping alone. I suggested she should join him, but she declined, saying, "Walking tires me out." Lately, she's become a typical mother-in-law. Previously, when I made her tea, she'd just say thank you, but now there's always a comment like "it's too warm" or "it's too weak." Whenever she speaks, it's either gossip or bad-mouthing someone. Being around her just brings me down, but I can't exactly reject her, so I just nod and force a smile. It's just not good. The grass keeps growing, and they never cut it. I've even thought about mowing it myself, my mother-in-law said, fervently discussing a neighbor's consistently neglected yard. As I was responding, "Oh," she suddenly stopped talking. I instinctively followed her gaze to the bookshelf. Did she find a book that piqued her interest? It would be peaceful if we could just read together. "Did you find a book you're interested in?" I asked as I was about to approach the bookshelf. Instead of a book, she reached past it, grabbing something from the rack next to it. "Susan, you shouldn't touch that," I said, hastily reaching out. But she just innocently opened it and exclaimed with delight, "Oh my Mary dear. Oh dear, didn't you overspend last month? Goodness, your electricity bill is twice as much as ours." My mother-in-law was looking at our household account book as if she were reading a weekly magazine. "Stop, give it back." I hurriedly snatched it away, but my mother-in-law laughed softly. "You really don't have to be so flustered, but Mary, it seems like you're not so good at saving money. Bob must feel bad having a wife who struggles with budgeting. You should try a bit harder, okay?" I could feel my face heating up. Both the front and back covers clearly stated it was the household account book, yet she had the nerve to open it. I couldn't believe it, and then she continued, "About those desserts. I have a soft spot for limited edition treats too, so I get the urge, but if you can't even save a dime, do you think you really deserve to indulge in sweets?" Furthermore, my mother-in-law kept on nagging, saying things like, "You spend way too much on food, and the electricity bill is outrageous." On top of that, she boasted about how frugal she was. After ranting for a while, she seemed satisfied and left. After she left, I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't stop crying. The accumulated stress might have played a part too. I reached my breaking point. I cried nonstop until Bob came home. He said, "You don't have to take Mom's word for it, but I think it's easier said than done. I'm really sorry. I'll tell Mom not to come again." "Yeah, please," I replied. Bob comforted me, and after I calmed down a bit, I decided to discuss something that had been bothering me, the electricity bill. As my mother-in-law had pointed out, it was unusually high without any significant changes in our usage. The bill had skyrocketed over the past few months. I had been concerned, but dealing with my mother-in-law left me little time to think about anything else. Bob looked at the electricity bill details, puzzled. "This is definitely strange." "I know, right? The next bill is coming soon, isn't it? If it seems off, we should give the electric company a call." A few days later, the bill arrived, charging us an astonishing $1,300, more than double our usual amount. Feeling something was amiss, we quickly decided to have someone from the electric company come over. The electric company's technician took a detailed look around and then pointed out something peculiar, calling us over. "Did you know about this wire?" As Bob and I approached, the technician gently moved a potted plant to reveal an external outlet that had been hidden by the long leaves. We have forgotten about it since we never used it after building the house. From that outlet, as the technician mentioned, a wire extended toward my in-laws' house. "Do you know anything about this wire?" the technician asked. Bob and I exchanged glances, likely thinking the same thing. "Hey, Bob, could this be?" I started. "Yeah, no doubt about it. This is why our electric bill shot up," Bob agreed. To be sure, we followed the wire with the technician, pushing through bushes and tall weeds. Sure enough, the wire led to my in-laws' storage shed. We couldn't see where it connected from there, but it was clear that it had something to do with their house. The technician looked at us with a stern expression and asked, "Do you want me to call the police?" Bob quickly replied, "No, we might have to, but let's talk it out first. This house belongs to our parents, after all. The technician, who initially seemed tense, relaxed upon realizing it was a family matter. Oh, I see. I'll be on my way then. Yes, thank you for taking the time to come out here. We really appreciate it, I said as we walked him out to his vehicle. After he left, Bob and I turned to each other, deep in thought. Bob sighed heavily, cradling his head in his hands. I'm sorry for having a mother like that. It's hard to say don't worry about it, I replied. What are we going to do next? If it's like any other day, Bob's parents are probably home right now. Should we confront them directly or come up with a plan first? Bob, with his hand covering his mouth, started walking toward the external outlet. The employee had moved the potted plant aside earlier, making the outlet clearly visible. Come to think of it, maybe Mom put the potted plant here on purpose to hide the outlet, Bob muttered. Though I hated to suspect, I couldn't think of any other reason. I wonder what this is connected to, Bob said, suddenly reaching out and unplugging the wire. Wait, is it okay to unplug that? I asked. I just did. The thought of them calmly stealing our electricity all this time makes me so angry. Anyway, we have the employee as a witness. I won't let them make any lame excuses if it comes to that, Bob responded, holding the unplugged wire firmly. Just then, a high-pitched scream rang out from Bob's parents' house, probably my mother-in-law's. Moments later, we heard hysterical muttering. The voices grew louder and then, with great momentum, my mother-in-law burst out from behind the hedge. She must not have expected anyone to be there, as she let out a deeply surprised voice. No, I'm surprised. What are you doing here? She snapped at us, but I puffed up my chest and responded, Susan, do you have some business in our yard? You seemed pretty flustered, didn't you? Well, that's... She looked away, visibly uncomfortable. Beyond her, Bob was holding the removed wire firmly, clearly awaiting an explanation. When my mother-in-law exclaimed, Oh, she tried to snatch the wire from Bob's hand, Bob twisted away, hiding the wire behind his back. Hey, what are you doing? He demanded. No, that's what I should be asking you, Bob retorted, thrusting the wire in front of her face and speaking in a deep, serious voice. This was plugged into our outlet, you know, emphasizing the R. My mother-in-law's eyes darted around for a moment, then she looked upwards defensively. So what, do you know where this wire goes? I have no idea, just plug it back in. Now things are a mess here since you pulled it out. How can she ask to plug it in without even knowing where it's connected? Plus, she's basically admitting she suffered because it was unplugged. It's almost like she's confessing that she did it, but my mother-in-law didn't seem the least bit guilty. She was just completely panicked. I knew why she was so flustered. Standing next to Bob, I smiled reassuringly. Susan, please calm down. How can we plug in a wire when we don't know where it leads? This is our outlet, isn't it? It's no big deal to plug it in. It's just for a moment, so please. Oh, Susan, remember what you told me? Not to waste even a bit of electricity, saying how Bob was unfortunate to have a wife who couldn't even save on electricity. Well, that was... She started to fidget. I won't make it in time, I heard her mutter under her breath. She seemed on the verge of panicking. What time is it now? She asked. Well, it's 9:57. Oh no, I'm done for. After that exclamation, my mother-in-law, stumbling all the way, hurriedly left. Bob was puzzled by his mother-in-law's strange behavior, and I knew the reason behind it. I whispered to Bob, is that what you mean? So if we keep hanging around like this, she'll show up again. That's right. Bob tossed the wire aside, and we headed back inside the house. A short while later, after a while, I heard a rattling sound at the front door, followed by the doorbell ringing. This is my mother-in-law. I unlocked the door and opened it. Hello, Susan. Continuing from what I said earlier. Enough of your chatter. Move over, my mother-in-law interrupted, pushing me aside as she entered. She was visibly upset. Her footsteps thundered like a monster's as she made her way to the living room. Then she heavily flopped onto the sofa. Bob, who was in the living room, furrowed his brows with a puzzled expression and was about to speak, but my mother-in-law was a tad quicker. Oh, I'm parched. Hey, is the tea not ready yet? You're so slow. Act before being told. That's basic etiquette. Water either. She hesitated, looking at the bottle, then back at Bob and me, clearly unsure of what to do. The tension in the room was palpable, and my mother-in-law's usually domineering presence seemed to shrink under the weight of the situation. Susan, please, let's just calm down. Bob finally spoke, trying to diffuse the tension. Mom, you need to explain yourself. We found that wire connected to our outlet, and the technician confirmed it led to your house. Why were you using our electricity? My mother-in-law looked down, wringing her hands nervously. I didn't mean for it to be a big deal. Just a little electricity for some extra things we couldn't afford to run. You know how tight things have been with your father's medical bills and all." Bob frowned, clearly upset. "That doesn't make it right, Mom. You should have asked if you were in trouble. Sneaking around like this, it's not okay." Tears welled up in my mother-in-law's eyes, and she began to sob. "I'm sorry, I just didn't want to burden you too with our problems. We were desperate." Seeing her cry, my anger softened a little, but I knew we couldn't let this go without addressing it properly. "Mom, we would have helped if you'd asked, but you can't just take from us without saying anything. It's not fair." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I understand. I'm sorry, really. I'll pay for the extra charges, I promise." Bob sighed, rubbing his temples. "We'll work something out. But you can't do this again. If you need help, you have to talk to us, not just take matters into your own hands." There was a long silence as my mother-in-law sat there, looking contrite. Finally, she nodded. "I understand. I'm truly sorry, both of you." We all sat there for a moment, the tension slowly easing. It was clear that while this situation was far from ideal, it was at least being addressed. We would have to find a way to move forward, but for now, we had taken the first step in dealing with the problem openly. The real problem starts now. When did you begin stealing our electricity? You always accuse me of stealing, which is awful, but the wire that's plugged into my outlet actually comes from your house. My mother-in-law didn't have a good excuse. She kept opening and closing her mouth, trying to think of a way to get out of this mess. Honestly, she just needs to admit it and apologize. I thought that would be the end of it, but then fate gave her a break. The doorbell rang. When I answered, it was my father-in-law. He had gone out shopping, and when he came back, the front door was unlocked. The TV was still on, but his wife was missing. He must have been worried. Seeing her chance, my mother-in-law ran to him, crying. My father-in-law looked embarrassed by her distress. Bob then explained everything from the beginning. After a moment of thought, my father-in-law asked, "Is there a mistake?" It was hard for him to believe that his wife was secretly stealing electricity from their son's house. "Who did the wiring? Do you think a stranger would go through the trouble of connecting someone else's wiring to another house?" My father-in-law crossed his arms, deep in thought. He nodded and said, "Let's go check it out." He stood up, but my mother-in-law, clearly flustered, tried to stop him. However, my father-in-law asked Bob to show him what was going on and walked toward the power outlet. The wiring led off into a storage shed and wasn't visible from where they were. When my father-in-law investigated and came back, he looked shocked. He said, "I'm so sorry. I truly am. Please apologize to them now." My mother-in-law, looking like a guilty child, said, "I'm sorry." My father-in-law explained that the wires led to a battery connected to my mother-in-law's computer through an extension cord. She bought the battery when she moved to her new house. The salesman had told her it was cost-effective to store electricity at night when it's cheaper and use it during the day. So she started using our house's electricity to charge the battery at night and use it during the day. At first, that was all she did. But since the extension cord had an extra socket, she began plugging in her computer and other appliances too. Eventually, she was using our electricity all day, not just at night. My mother-in-law justified her actions by saying she heard it was more economical. I was annoyed that she was stealing electricity, but what made me even angrier was that despite her constant criticism of me and my spending, she was lying the whole time. She used to say how Bob was unlucky to have a wife who couldn't save money and criticized me for buying sweets. But now, her lack of remorse was clear. Using someone else's electricity to save on your bill isn't being economical, it's theft. I told them clearly that I wouldn't let this go just because we're family. If they didn't apologize sincerely, we have to involve the police. My mother-in-law looked shocked, maybe because she thought she could get away with it. She tried to say that we were betraying family, but I explained we just wanted things to be right. When I pulled out my phone, she panicked and tried to rush toward me. Bob stopped her and said we had plenty of evidence. I pointed to the roof where our security cameras were installed. My mother-in-law looked even more scared when she realized the cameras had captured everything around the outlet. I asked if this was enough proof and then added, "Today was the release date for a limited edition dessert. I had a friend buy it for me because you were so busy stealing electricity that you missed out on it." I gave her a cheeky smile. My mother-in-law fell to the ground, trembling. After discussing with Bob, we decided not to report her to the police. We had evidence, but it seemed more troublesome than useful, and since she was family, we thought it might be overlooked. Instead, we decided to have my in-laws pay for the electricity they used and give us extra for the trouble. Living close to them meant things would be awkward, but it was necessary for my peace of mind. Our interactions became strained as a result. One day, we got some good news. My in-laws were moving back to their old house. Rumors about their electricity theft had spread, especially about my mother-in-law. She was very upset and cried, saying she wanted to return to her old place. I thought my mother-in-law got along well with her neighbors, but it turned out she didn't. She was just being treated kindly because people thought she was delicate. After paying us for the electricity and covering moving expenses, my in-laws complained about being out of money. We decided not to help them. I hoped they'd cut back on their sweets and manage on their own. Now that my mother-in-law is gone, I could enjoy life more. Our electric bill is much lower, and I'm happily deciding which dessert to treat myself to next.